day my daughter dropped me off at Sunrise Ridge Care Home, she kissed me on the cheek, told me she'd call me on Sunday, and drove away before I'd even made it through the front door. That was 11 weeks ago. She hasn't called once. I want to tell you about the woman who knocked on my door on a Tuesday evening in February, when the wind outside was doing that particular thing it does in Ontario in the dead of winter. Not howling, just pressing, like it's trying to get in everywhere at once. I want to tell you what she said to me, but to understand why it mattered so much, you need to know what the weeks before that Tuesday had felt like. My name is Arthur. I'm 71 years old. For 34 years I taught woodworking and technical design at Lakeview Secondary School in Burlington, Ontario. I retired at 63. A little early, people said, but my knees had other ideas, and the shop floor wasn't getting any softer. I had a good run. I coached the skills competition team 4 years running. 2 of my students went on to become licensed carpenters. One of them sent me a card when I retired. I still have it somewhere in a box. My wife Helen passed 8 years ago. Ovarian cancer, diagnosed in March, gone by October. That's the kind of math that breaks you permanently. You don't recover from 7 months, you just learn to carry it differently. After Helen, I lived alone in the house in Burlington, the one we'd bought in 1989, the one with the detached garage I'd turned into a proper workshop. I kept up with the property, shoveled my own driveway until I was 68, mowed the lawn, made furniture for people in the neighborhood when they asked, a mudroom bench here, a set of bookshelves there. I wasn't crumbling. I wasn't a burden. I was just a man living in a house that was too quiet. My daughter Simone is 42. She's an operations manager for a logistics company out of Mississauga. She's good at her job, organized, efficient, decisive. Those qualities served her well professionally. In family life, they landed a little differently. Her husband, Trevor Alwood, 44, works in commercial real estate. He's the kind of man who shakes your hand too firmly and talks over you without realizing he's doing it. Or maybe he realizes it and just doesn't stop. I was never sure which. He and Simone have 2 kids. My grandchildren Bea and James, 9 and 12, and a house in Oakville that they are very proud of and that I was very rarely invited to. That started when Trevor came into the picture. Before him, Simone and I were close. She'd call on a Wednesday evening just to talk. We'd have dinner every couple of weeks. After Helen died, she came and stayed with me for 10 days. And we didn't talk about grief directly, not once, but we watched old hockey games and she taught herself to use my router table, and that was its own kind of language. Trevor didn't dislike me. I want to be fair about that. He just redirected things. After they got married, dinners became twice a year, calls became monthly, then every 6 weeks, then, Dad, things have just been so crazy lately. I understood. People get busy. Families shift. I told myself that. I told myself that a lot. About 2 years ago, I had a minor stroke. Minor is a relative word. I lost some function in my left hand for about 3 weeks. It came back mostly, but not completely. I have trouble with fine motor things now, buttoning shirts, using small tools. The workshop became harder. The stroke also scared Simone in a way that, I think now, had more to do with Trevor than with me. He was the one who started talking about long-term planning. He was the one who sent me articles about independent living facilities. He was the one who, at a dinner in September, one of the twice-yearly ones, said very casually, the timing could actually work out well with the Burlington house if you think about it. I didn't ask what he meant. I should have. By November, Simone sat me down and explained that they'd found a place. Sunrise Ridge in Hamilton. 40 minutes from Burlington, she said, as if proximity was the variable that mattered. She said it had good reviews. She said the staff were lovely. She said they had activities. She said it made sense financially because they could help me transition the house. Help me, she said, meaning that Trevor had spoken to a real estate agent already. I asked her if we could talk about this more, if I could visit a few places, if we could take our time. She said they'd already put down a deposit. I moved in on December 14th. It was a Thursday. Simone carried 2 boxes in, kissed me, and said she'd call Sunday. The room at Sunrise Ridge is fine. I want to say that plainly. It isn't a bad place. The staff are professional. The food is acceptable. There's a common room with a television that plays the weather network on a loop and a puzzle table that someone is always working on. I am not being mistreated. I am just warehoused, is the word that kept coming to me in those first weeks. Set down somewhere with the understanding that the arrangement was permanent and the matter was closed. I called Simone on the Sunday she'd promised. It went to voicemail. I left a message. I called the following Wednesday. Voicemail. I texted, something I am not comfortable doing. My thumbs don't cooperate the way they used to. And I said simply that I'd like to hear her voice. She sent back a thumbs up emoji. I looked at that for a long time. By January, I'd mostly stopped trying. Not out of anger. Out of a kind of exhaustion I don't have the right words for. The loneliness at Sunrise Ridge is a specific texture. It's not the sharp loneliness of a bad day. It's the flat, wide loneliness of being somewhere that was chosen for you, surrounded by people in the same situation, all of us very politely not mentioning it. I started eating dinner early, before the common room filled up. I went to bed at 8:30. I didn't use the workshop table they had in the recreation room because the tools were cheap and nothing was calibrated properly, and it made me miss my garage in a way I couldn't afford to feel. That was the shape of my days when the woman knocked on my door. It was a Tuesday in February. 7:15 in the evening. I was reading a novel about the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway that Helen had bought at a used bookstore and that I'd found in a box when I was packing. I'd been meaning to read it for 12 years. The knock was tentative at first, then a little more certain. I opened the door and found a woman, late 30s, I'd have guessed, dark hair pulled back, wearing the burgundy vest that Sunrise Ridge's administrative staff wore. I'd seen her around the building a few times, but had taken her for one of the coordinators who organized the afternoon programs I never attended. She said, "Mr. Waverly? I'm sorry to bother you in the evening. My name is Greta Solberg. I'm the facility director here. I just started in this role last month. I've been meaning to come by and introduce myself to all the residents personally, and I kept meaning to come by sooner, but..." She stopped. She was looking at me with an expression I didn't recognize. "I'm sorry. I need to ask you something and it might seem a little strange." I told her to go ahead. She said, "Did you teach at Lakeview Secondary in Burlington?" I said I had. 34 years. She said, "Technical design shop class?" I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I don't know if you'd remember me. I was there in the late 90s. Greta Paulson, that was my last name then. I was in your grade 11 class. I was the only girl in it, I think." I looked at her. Paulson. Late 90s. I had a practice of writing a few notes in a small notebook at the end of each school year. Not about grades, but about students who'd stayed with me somehow. A line or two. I hadn't thought about those notebooks in years, but standing in the doorway of a room in a care home in Hamilton, something moved in my memory. "Greta Paulson," I said. "You probably don't. You built a step stool," I said, "for your first project. Everyone else built the same thing, the standard birdhouse or the little tool caddy. You came in on the first day and said you wanted to build something your grandmother could use." She put her hand over her mouth. "Your grandmother had bad knees," I said, "and she needed something to reach the top shelf in her kitchen. You asked me if that was an acceptable project, and I said that anything designed to make someone's life easier was always an acceptable project." Greta Solberg stood in my doorway in her burgundy vest and cried. Not dramatically, just the quick, surprised crying of someone who wasn't expecting to feel something. She apologized immediately. I told her not to. She came in and sat down and we talked for an hour and a half. She told me that in the winter of 1998, her parents had separated. Not cleanly. There was another person involved. There was a custody dispute. There was a period where she was living out of a bag between two houses, and neither parent was reliably present. She was 15. She said she'd been failing 3 classes and had stopped caring whether she failed them. She said shop class was the only period in the day when she felt like herself. She said she'd built that step stool, and I'd told her it was good work. Not good for a girl, not good for a first project, just good work. And that I'd asked her one afternoon when she'd stayed to sand it down if everything at home was all right. She said she'd told me the truth, which surprised her, because she hadn't been telling anyone the truth. She said I'd listened for a long time without interrupting or trying to fix anything, and then I'd told her that some winters are just longer than others, and that she'd built something real with her own hands today, and that nobody could take that from her. I didn't remember saying that. I believe I said it. It sounds like something I'd say, but I didn't remember the specific conversation, and I told her so, honestly. I said I was sorry I didn't remember. She shook her head. She said that was the thing about kindness. The person giving it often doesn't carry it the same way the person receiving it does. She'd thought about that conversation many times over the years. Through a difficult college experience, through a first job that didn't work out, through a marriage that ended after 4 years, through a slow rebuilding that eventually led her here, to this role, to this building. She'd thought about the man who hadn't tried to solve her problem, had just acknowledged it, and then pointed her toward what she'd made with her hands. I sat with that for a moment. Then I told her about Simone. I don't know why. I hadn't talked about it with anyone. not even the staff member who'd done my initial intake interview. But something about the evening, about the specificity of what she'd just told me, made the words come out. I told her about Helen, about the house in Burlington, about the deposit that had already been placed before I knew there was anything to decide, about the Sunday that never came, and the thumbs up emoji. Greta didn't say it was complicated. She didn't explain Simone's perspective or tell me that these things take time. She just sat across from me in the ugly upholstered chair that had come with the room and said, "I'm so sorry, Mr. Waverly. That shouldn't have happened to you. That was all. It was enough. It was more than I'd been given in 2 months." Before she left, she said she was going to do a few things differently with my file. Not special treatment, she clarified, but things that should have been done from the start. A different room assignment if I wanted it on the garden side of the building, which got afternoon light. Access to a proper tool cabinet they kept locked in the workshop room. Better equipment than what was out on the table, not usually offered to residents without a specific request and an assessment. She'd make sure I was on the list. I told her she didn't have to do that. She said, "You told me I'd built something real with my own hands, and nobody could take it from me." That turned out to be true. I want you to be able to say the same thing. I moved to the garden room the following week. I started going to the workshop in the mornings. I was building a small cabinet, nothing complicated, just a bedside table with a drawer and a lower shelf, when Simone called in March. It was a Saturday morning, which was unusual. She said she'd been meaning to call. I told her I knew. There was a silence, and then she said she'd heard I had access to a workshop. I told her I did. She asked if I was doing okay, and I said I was keeping busy, which was true without being the whole truth. She said she'd been talking to Trevor. I didn't say anything. She said they'd been discussing coming to visit, that she thought the kids would like to see me, that she was sorry it had been. She paused. A difficult few months. Difficult, yes, that word works. I told her that a visit would be good. I told her I was building a bedside table, and that James might like to see how dovetail joints work if he was interested in that kind of thing. Simone was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "He actually asks about your garage sometimes." That hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. She came 2 weekends later. Trevor stayed home, a prior commitment, she said, and I chose not to examine that closely. Simone came with Bea and James, and they stayed for 4 hours, which was longer than any visit in recent memory. James did in fact want to see the dovetail joints. He stood beside me at the work table for 40 minutes, asking questions about grain direction and why wood moves when humidity changes. And I thought about Greta Paulson, standing at a workbench in 1998, asking if a step stool for her grandmother was an acceptable project. Bea sat with me afterward and showed me something on her tablet, a video about Japanese joinery techniques, which she'd found somehow, for reasons I didn't ask about. She said the boxes they made looked like puzzles. I said that was more or less exactly what they were. Simone and I didn't have a large conversation that afternoon. We didn't resolve anything formally. But she sat across from me at the small table in my room while the kids were exploring the building with a staff member, and she said, "I think we should have talked more before December." I said I agreed. She said, "I don't know how to fix it." I said I didn't either, but that I thought starting with visits was a reasonable first step. She nodded. She looked tired in a way I hadn't noticed before, tired in the particular way that people get when they've been managing something poorly and know it and haven't known how to say so. I recognized it because I'd felt it myself after Helen died, when I tried for about 6 months to be fine instead of being not fine. I didn't push. I didn't make her account for the 11 weeks. It wasn't that I'd forgiven everything, exactly. Forgiveness isn't a single moment, I've learned that much. It's more that I saw her sitting there, genuinely uncertain and genuinely sorry, and I thought about what Greta had said to me about kindness, about how the person receiving it carries it differently than the person giving it. And I thought about how the things we do, small or large, remembered or forgotten, keep moving forward in time without us, compounding quietly, touching people we'll never know we touched. The step stool Greta built in 1998 is probably long gone. But the conversation that happened while she was sanding it is sitting in a care home workshop in Hamilton right now, in the form of a man who is building a bedside table and teaching his grandson about the way wood moves. Simone now visits every second Saturday. She doesn't always stay long. Sometimes it's an hour, sometimes closer to 3. She calls on Wednesday evenings, which is when I used to cook a proper dinner when she was a teenager, and she'd sit at the kitchen island and tell me about her week. I don't know if she remembers that, I haven't asked. Trevor came once in April. He shook my hand the way he always does and made a comment about the facility being nicer than he'd expected, which I took as the closest thing to an apology available to him. James brought a book about woodworking that he'd got from the library. I told him to keep it, that I'd see him in 2 weeks anyway. I finished the bedside table last month. It's not my best work. The drawer runs a little tight in humid weather, which I should have accounted for better, but the dovetails are clean and the finish is even, and it holds up a lamp and 2 books and the CPR railway novel I'm still working through. Every morning when I turn on the lamp, I think about Greta Paulson standing in my doorway on a Tuesday in February, asking if I remembered a step stool. I think about the grandmother with bad knees who could reach her top shelf because a 15-year-old girl needed something to build. I think about how nothing we do carefully and honestly for another person is ever really wasted, even when we forget we did it. Especially then. Some winters are just longer than others, but they do end.